No man wants a woman who argues like a lawyer. That's what my father said the week I left for college. He didn't raise his voice, just said it flat, like he was diagnosing a flaw in my design. Back then, I was just Naomi 19, invisible, too intense for dinner talk. Now I'm Chief Justice Naomi Ellis of the New York Supreme Court. But before they respected my title, they rejected my voice. I was gripping a scholarship letter, like it was proof I was allowed to want something more. Be more like your sister, he added, glancing at Rachel, who stood nearby in a floral dress and a smile trained to please. That sentence didn't break me. It shaped me. Years later, I walked into the Supreme Court of New York not as a visitor, not as a sister, but as the Chief Justice. No announcement, no cameras, just a navy suit, a calm face, and the weight of everything they never clapped for. Inside, the courtroom stilled. The air shifted like the walls themselves realized who had just walked in. Conversations died mid-sentence. The clerk glanced up, did a double take, then lowered his head. I scanned the room slowly. The case file waiting on my desk read, State of New York versus Rachel Ellis. Rachel, the family's favourite, their pride and product. The same sister who built a business on viral candy videos, who called me too intense behind closed doors, who sold image over integrity, and who now sat at the defendant's table looking suddenly small. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I just took my place behind the bench, high and solid and carved from oak, the kind of seat no one ever imagined I'd earn. But I had, every grueling step of it. Her lawyer noticed first. He leaned over, whispered something sharp. Rachel blinked hard, her mouth slightly open. The moment hit like a dropped glass in a quiet room. Then the clerk's voice broke the silence. Your Honour, Chief Justice Naomi Ellis. The sound cracked the air. Rachel's face drained of colour. My mother's hand trembled on her purse strap. My father looked down at the floor as if suddenly fascinated by the grain in the tile. I knew they recognised me. What they didn't recognise was my power. The same girl they once called too much, too serious, too bookish, now held authority over the very process that would determine Rachel's future. And I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My presence alone rewrote the script they'd clung to for decades. Rachel sat frozen, her lawyer, whispering again, this time faster. She turned her head slowly, meeting my eyes for the first time in years. There was no smugness in her face now, only disbelief. She mouthed something, maybe Naomi, but I gave her nothing in return. This wasn't personal, this was court. I read the charges: commercial fraud, false advertising, reckless endangerment. Her wellness candy, sold as a vegetable substitute, had triggered medical incidents across the state. A product built on aesthetics and lies. No science, no oversight, just branding and blind confidence. And for a while, it worked. Until it didn't. The bailiff stood taller now. The junior attorneys scribbled harder. Even the court stenographer paused a moment longer between keystrokes. I could feel the shift, the slow realization settling into every corner of the room. The woman they dismissed had not only survived, she had arrived. Rachel's voice cracked. Naomi, please. It wasn't a command, it was a reach. I looked at her steadily. Ms. Ellis, I said, my voice firm, addressed the court appropriately. Her breath caught. The correction stung. For the first time, she had to earn her place in the room. I remembered Thanksgiving 2 years earlier when she toasted her 6-figure income while I silently reviewed policy drafts between courses. I remembered how they called her business-minded and called me single. How they praised her packaging and ignored my publications. They celebrated sparkle. I built substance. And now, here we were. Outside, the press was gathering. I knew that before I even heard the first shutter click in the hallway, they'd get their headline soon enough. But inside this courtroom, no one reached for drama. No one dared, because justice doesn't shout. It walks in quiet and absolute, and takes its seat. And as I sat there, staring down at the stack of legal briefs that outlined my sister's deception, my mind drifted not forward, but back, to a room with peeling wallpaper and a single bookshelf that was mine alone. I used to sit there for hours, legs crossed, elbows propped on a pillow, reading about laws I couldn't yet enforce, and freedoms I didn't yet have. I didn't play dress-up. I didn't ask for dolls. I asked for hardcover books on constitutional law for Christmas. My mother thought it was a phase. My father called it obsessive. But Rachel. She twirled in sparkly dresses and called herself Princess of the Day, and they clapped like she'd cured cancer. There's a photo somewhere. Rachel in a yellow sundress frosting on her cheeks, laughing next to a cake covered in edible glitter. I'm standing off to the side, half smiling, clutching a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird Like a Lifeline. That was my 8th birthday. No one remembered it was mine, too. They called me too serious before I could even spell the word. When I asked questions about the news, my mother would wave me off. Don't talk about politics at the dinner table, Naomi. It's rude. When I asked about injustice, I saw in school how some students were always sent to detention, while others walked free. My father shook his head and said, "Stop trying to make everything so heavy. Just be a kid." But I couldn't unsee what I saw, and I couldn't unlearn what I felt. Rachel, though Rachel was light. Light on her feet, light in conversation, light enough to float right into every heart in the room. She had a gift for timing. She knew when to laugh, when to feign confusion, when to compliment my mother's cooking, even when it was burned. "You're so sweet," Mom would say, kissing her on the forehead. Such a little lady. I, on the other hand, got reminded to fix my posture and smile more. I was 13 the first time my mother said, "Naomi, the way you carry yourself. Men don't like girls who are too sharp." I was 14 when she told me, "You better soften up or you'll scare them all away." But I didn't want to be softened. I didn't want to shrink myself into something someone else could find convenient. I wanted to matter on my own terms. Rachel could fake humility like it was an art. She'd do the dishes only when Dad was watching. She'd volunteer to fold laundry the minute guests arrived. And afterward, my parents would beam. "She's so helpful. You could learn from her, Naomi." I didn't argue. What was the point? Every disagreement became proof of my stubbornness. Every silence was labelled attitude. So I studied harder. I buried myself in mock trials and speech team. I found refuge in debate club where sharpness wasn't a flaw, it was a weapon. Our home wasn't a war zone, it was a stage play. Rachel learned her lines perfectly. I kept rewriting mine until the director stopped casting me. During family parties, I was sent to refill drinks while Rachel got centre stage for her latest TikTok routine. She's so creative, they'd cheer. I wrote an editorial that won a state award, and no one even mentioned it at dinner. The worst part wasn't the absence of praise. It was the abundance of performance. The way my parents insisted they were just trying to help. That I needed to be more flexible, less rigid, easier to love. As if love required camouflage. As if I couldn't be loved unless I were someone else. I remember one evening, 16 years old, sitting on the porch while Rachel live-streamed inside. I could hear her giggles through the window, the fake bubbly voice she used for followers. My father stepped out and looked at me. "You know he said your sister's got real potential. People like her. She knows how to win a room." Then he added, You know how to win arguments. But who wants to argue with their daughter all the time?" That was the moment I stopped trying to explain myself. That was when I realised I wasn't going to be the daughter they bragged about at barbecues. I was going to be the woman they couldn't ignore when she stood in court. Not because I changed, but because the world finally caught up to the truth I carried all along. Rachel was the sun in their eyes, always bright, always visible. I was the moon, quiet, constant, pulling tides in my favour while no one noticed. She lit up the room. I lit up the system. Now, in this courtroom, she was the one behind the desk waiting to be judged, and I was the one in robes asking the questions. Tell me, who's too serious now? My mind drifted to a stage bathed in warm light and filled with unfamiliar faces. Law school graduation, rows of parents clutching flowers, leaning forward to capture blurry photos of their children crossing the stage. I remember scanning the crowd eyes, hunting for a familiar outline, anyone. But my row was empty. My family didn't come. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't think it mattered. The same week, Rachel went viral, gifting our mum a designer handbag on livestream. It was perfectly scripted, sentimental music, exaggerated surprise, a squeal, a hug, and over 80,000 likes in 24 hours. She's such a good daughter, the comments gushed, so thoughtful. My mum reposted it with the caption, proud beyond words. I didn't see her post anything about my degree. I doubt she even knew the name of the school I attended. She once said on the phone with a friend, not knowing I was in the next room, Naomi's just all books and no life. She'll probably be alone forever. The laughter that followed wasn't malicious. It was casual, like they were discussing the weather. But I wasn't surprised. The signs had always been there. I'd come home on breaks, eyes sunken from sleepless nights of case law, and my dad would still ask, "You sure this law thing isn't just a phase?" Rachel, meanwhile, brought a bag of free skincare from some sponsor and was treated like royalty. She's going places, they'd say. I used to wonder what places meant exactly. I'd been to courtrooms and Capitol Hill. She'd been to brand brunches in Beverly Hills. One afternoon, I was invited to a legal roundtable in DC, alongside a former Supreme Court clerk. I emailed my family, included a link to the live stream, said it was important to me. No one replied. Later, my mum tagged me in a group photo from Rachel's pre-launch party for her candy brand. Our golden girl building her empire, the caption read. I wasn't even in the frame. So I stopped sharing. I stopped sending updates, forwarding articles, inviting them to panels or milestones. I focused inward. I applied to clerk for a federal judge and was accepted. I got offers from top-tier law firms, but turned them down for a job at the public defender's office. Smaller paycheck, bigger purpose. When I told my mother, she frowned through the phone. You gave up a 6-figure job to help criminals. She said like she'd discovered I was joining a cult. But that's the difference between Rachel and me. She performs goodness. I practice it. They once called me cold for not crying at family dinners. But I'd seen too much in courtrooms to cry for a table that had no place for me. They said I was too intense, too sharp. But that sharpness carved paths through systems designed to silence girls like me. I think back to that moment on stage, accepting my law degree, my voice echoing across the auditorium as I gave the student address. There is a quiet kind of power in being overlooked. You learn to build things no one else sees until they can't look away. The audience rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous, but my family never heard it. When the full-ride scholarship email arrived, subject congratulations, Georgetown Law, there was no one to celebrate with. I sat alone in my dorm room staring at the screen, heart racing. I had worked for this moment, clawed my way through every prerequisite, burned through nights, outlining torts and statutes, and it had finally paid off. I thought about calling home. Maybe this would be the moment they saw me. But the thought dissolved almost instantly. I knew how that call would go, so I took a screenshot and saved it to a private folder. Proof that I had done something worth clapping for, even if the applause never came. A week later, Rachel posted a video of herself on a yacht, champagne in hand, announcing her brand's soft launch. The caption read, "Built this from scratch. No handouts, just hustle." My mother commented under the post, "That's my girl. I stared at that comment for longer than I should have. 4 words typed without hesitation. She'd never said them to me, not once. That night, I stared at my scholarship letter again, not for reassurance, but as a silent promise to myself. One day, I'll build something so unignorable, even silence will have to stand and notice. They missed my graduation, they missed the oath I took, but they won't miss what happens next. Because the next time they sit in a courtroom, they won't be the ones holding the gavel. I will. But before that day came, there was another stage. One bathed in neon lights and dopamine hits where Rachel thrived, and our family cheered like they'd found new royalty. She transformed her viral fame into a brand a wellness queen, promising better living through candy. Her TikTok broadcasts became routine Monday night events in our household. She'd appear on screen tossing bags of her veggie sweet, product camera, rolling makeup, flawless hair perfectly waved. She'd press the square in, and lights would flare just enough glow to make her eyes shimmer. "Check this out," she'd say, holding up a slick pouch. "I'm doing 6 figures a month now. Real people eating better, feeling happier, one candy at a time." The numbers spun upward like shares. That's goals, comments stacked like trophies. Her dance routine was choreographed to perfection. Foot stomp, hips shift candy into mouth a wink. The caption flashed, "Eat candy, not veggies. It's cute, it's fun, it's healthy." It pulled in 2 million views in under 24 hours. The family group chat exploded. My mother posted her thumbnail next to a gold heart emoji, and the caption, "Our family's pride and joy." My father forwarded the video to his friends, calling Rachel the real entrepreneur here. I watched from the sidelines, feeling a familiar twinge. I had built my persona in law libraries and courtrooms realms, invisible to the trending tide. They saw the sparkle influencers, clicks not integrity policy, quiet change. I spoke up once. After one of her streams where she claimed her candy could replace 5 servings of vegetables, I sent a calm message. "You should get it tested. Label it properly. It may be misleading." My phone buzzed immediately. "Don't be jealous. Not everything needs your law degree, Naomi." The message read more like a dismissal than a reply. They all sided with her. My caution, my concern, it was old-fashioned negative and overly critical. And because I said it, I was dramatic. My mother's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Oh, Naomi just wants to ruin her big sister's success. Typical." The sweetness I'd once been accused of lacking tasted bitter in that moment, but I couldn't unsee the issue. I emailed a friend working at a state health lab. "Hey, can you test a sample?" A few weeks later, the results came back. 0 fiber high sugar count, plus undisclosed artificial acids. Not what Rachel had promised. I sat on the email, unsure exposing her would crush her success, but letting it slide would hurt the public. By now, my heart was no longer intervening. Meanwhile, Rachel's life glowed on social media. Her second viral hit had her dancing in a pastel kitchen hands full of her product Gut, Health is Trending. But my candy is what matters. Filters smoothed her skin. Soft focus surrounded her like halo. Comments read, "Obsessed bub, buying." "So true, I hate salads." My mother's favourite comment. "See, that's my girl, doing something real." My father shared the video with co-workers saying she's on to the next big thing. In private moments, I reached out again. "Rachel, you might be misleading people." She cut me off. "You don't get it, lawyer girl. This is more than law, it's business brand movement." Her hand blurred the screen as she waved me away. It was part dismissal, part ambition. I saw it the way I'd watched her rehearsing her smile for cameras. Scripted, packaged, delivered, but the contradiction gnawed at me. Candy sold as health. Fun pushed as science. Followers crowned ethics, buried. I thought of the people who trusted her young mums, Sick kids, those desperate for a quick fix. I thought of the law I'd been studying, the justice I'd sworn to uphold. And I made a decision. If this faulty product went unchallenged, I would answer for it, no matter how high she climbed, or how loud our family cheered. My silence until now had been kind, but it was kinder to speak up, even if it meant breaking the illusion. I prepared an email to the State Lab and the Consumer Protection Bureau. I drafted a letter to our mother. You called me critical. I call it responsible. Watch this space. My finger hovered, and then I sent them all quietly, firmly, unwaveringly. The foundation of Rachel's empire began to crack just as mine consolidated. Because while she was dazzling people with sugar-coated promises, I was preparing the case file that would bring transparency to her empire. It began with a call late one Saturday night. "Mum," the voice said, cautious and hushed, "we have a situation." A mother in rural upstate had rushed her 6-year-old daughter to the ER after the veggie sweet candy caused intense stomach pain and dehydration. Soon, reports poured in, teachers noticing sugar crashes, hospital staff flagging intestinal distress. The pattern couldn't be ignored: widespread harm linked to one product. The Consumer Protection Bureau sprang into action. They asked to see lab results, manufacturing processes, packaging details. I forwarded everything. I had the state lab report, the breakdown showing 0 fiber despite 100% vegetable sugar, emblazoned on the packet the disclosure of artificial sweeteners and laxatives that had never been listed. A forensic expert's letter called it inaccurate, misleading, and intentionally deceptive. Headlines soon followed: popular TikTok, candy under investigation, viral treat, may harm gut health, thousands at risk. And the story wasn't just about a product, it was about trust betrayed. Viewers who had believed in Rachel felt deceived. Investors pulled out. Influencers who once promoted her brand deleted their videos. In that same instant, the ecosystem that propelled her empire began to crumble. Within days, the district attorney's office scheduled a press conference. Potential commercial fraud, they announced false advertising, and health endangerment charges will be referred for prosecution. People gasped. The camera flashed not on Rachel's smiling face, but on mine, smiling but stern robes, replaced by my private life suit and badge, public defender turned federal prosecutor. I hadn't spoken at the podium, but my presence loomed in every frame, a reminder that accountability could come from anywhere. Inside the Ellis household, everything shifted. My parents, once so eager to celebrate Rachel's viral posts, now buzzed with panic. "Get a lawyer," my mother hissed into her phone, pacing the living room and clutching her pearls. "We need to contain this. Call Jenna Fitzgerald, she's handled worse." Jenna Fitzgerald was their crisis manager, known for smoothing PR disasters before lawsuits even began. Rachel, however, frayed. She locked herself in her room, screens off. No liveliness, no measured tone. The girl who once radiated confidence now stared at the ceiling, haunted. Her lawyer drafted statements promising to cooperate fully. My mother was filmed in a short clip on a local news teaser. "We are deeply sorry for anyone affected. We will do everything to make this right." The statement felt hollow. Even the news anchor scoffed, noting a PR team working overtime. Reporters dove deeper, unearthing photos of lavish vacations, sponsorship deals, behind-the-scenes images of candy factories lacking health certifications. The assignments weren't gentle. How honest is her health angle? Did she cut corners to go viral? A golden child turned golden fool. Even loyal followers began leaving the group chat, lamenting betrayal and demanding refunds. My family watched all this collapse from a distance. My father didn't know where to look. My mother had begun ghosting any message that mentioned Rachel's name. The crisis manager drafted apologies, donation plans, product recalls, but even that was too late. Reputation isn't rebuilt once trust breaks. In the court of public opinion, Rachel was already being tried. The legal process would take its time, but the damage was immediate. Customers who paid $20 per pouch were offered refunds, but rumours of side effects circulated faster than phone chains. One viral TikTok video showed a collapsed kid in a classroom after eating a candy she said was healthy. That clip had millions of views before the video was even taken down. Through it all, I remained silent on social media, but every step felt ordained. I had warned them. I had tried to guide them. And now, as the legal system moved in, I stood behind the scenes ready to testify if called. Not because I had to, but because someone needed to answer. And if it wasn't her sister, then it would be the law. The clock ticked. The boardroom, where Rachel once pitched new flavours, became a war room for legal strategy. Emails flew, people left the brand team, almost everyone except one person, me. I watched all this unravel with measured quiet, because power isn't always loud. Sometimes it shakes foundations before the cracks show. The morning of the court hearing, I left my office early. No entourage, no announcement, just me in a plain navy coat, a notebook, and 2 polished shoes stepping on marble. I didn't need theatrics. I wanted to be unseen. I walked into the gallery, slid into the front row, and closed my eyes for a moment, centering myself. It was the same seat from my teenage trials of isolation, but this time I owned the space. The courtroom doors opened. Rachel appeared, her face drawn. The media glare was gone behind glass partitions, but I saw her glance up, saw her eyes land on me, and I stayed silent. The hush was palpable. Lawyers shuffled papers. The judge looked down, paused mid-stride, then settled at the bench. The bailiff called the room to order. I didn't interject. I didn't beckon attention. I just sat, and that simple presence tilted the balance of the room. The defense attorney, confident in his opening statement just minutes earlier, froze mid-speech at the sight of me. His words caught in his throat. He cleared it, looked up and stuttered, "Your Honour, Chief Justice Naomi Ellis." The name felt heavier than any indictment. The room fell into absolute stillness, silent and suspended. Rachel gasped a quiet sound that rippled across the rows. My mother's hand shook so visibly that she gripped the edge of her chair. My father lowered his gaze to his shoes. He didn't look up, but I saw the tremor in his shoulders. They had raised me to read books, raised her to read people, and now I was reading her fate. I opened my notebook. On the first page, in clear lettering, for transparency, for public trust, not for family drama, not for revenge, for justice. The bailiff cleared his throat. The judge gave me a nod, signalling that proceedings could resume. The clerk resumed the docket. Case 24-1034, State of New York, versus Rachel Ellis. The charge: commercial fraud, false advertising, endangering public health. The jury was already selected, their expressions unreadable behind austere masks. Rachel's attorney stood swallowed and tried again. The tension was so thick you could taste it. Words that once commanded boardrooms now felt brittle in his mouth. I listened intently. A part of me remembered being in the same seat, nervous, eager, unheard. But not today. Today, I was heard. And in hearing me, they all learned a new language: accountability. At one point, my mother inhaled sharply. I heard her whisper to my father, too low for the judge, for the jury, for the reporters. "Is that?" she asked. "Is she our Naomi?" My father didn't answer. He placed a restraining hand over hers. She nodded, stunned. Meanwhile, Rachel stared at me. I felt the weight of her stare, filled with disbelief and fear. The sister they once paraded as the family's golden girl was now pleading her case in front of the sister they dismissed as burdensome. I didn't flinch. I maintained composure. I didn't look at the gallery or my family. I focused on facts. My presence ensured clarity. No bias, just law. And the room bowed to that. The prosecuting attorney laid out the evidence lab reports, expert testimony emails confirming untested ingredients, a trail of warnings blown off by Rachel's team. The jurors scribbled. I watched them. Eyes disengaged from me, focused now on the crime, not the family feud. Rachel sobbed when one mother testified about her daughter's allergic reaction, her voice small and cracked. My chest tightened. I remembered being a child, silent at family tables, watching others cry for reasons I never understood. Now, I wasn't the one ignored. Now, I was the one setting the record right. At mid-morning, the courtroom doors opened briefly, and a gasp came from the back. Reporters stacked outside with cameras and notepads, whispering about viral angles, Chief Justice in family court. Sister sentenced sister. The courtroom was no longer just legal territory, it was a moral theatre. The judge paused the proceedings for a brief recess. Rachel's attorney looked desperately in my direction as we stood for recess. His voice barely a whisper, Your Honour. He couldn't finish. He didn't need to. The moment stretched. He backed away, unsettled. I stood, caught the eyes of my mother for a heartbeat. She shuffled back, grip loosened, tears shadowing her eyes. Our eyes met, and I offered nothing, just observation. Not pity, not triumph, just recognition. I left the gallery first. I didn't flee. I exited with calm purpose straight down the aisle, past rows of witnesses, reporters, and jurors. My robe brushed the benches. My heart beat steady. Outside, I felt the press swarm. They knew. The story wasn't my verdict. It was the presence of justice even in personal places. And I delivered one statement I was attending in a personal capacity. No further comment. Then I walked on silent, unwavering. Because sometimes the most powerful verdict is simply showing up and holding ground. Inside the courtroom, the air felt denser. Not heavier, just more aware. Every breath, every motion now lived under the weight of something unspoken, but undeniably present. I didn't need a nameplate to declare my authority. The room recognized it instinctively. Eyes followed me, not with curiosity, but caution, like I'd become a mirror no one wanted to look into. As I sat behind the bench, I felt the subtle tremble of power that wasn't seized but earned. The gavel lay to my right untouched. I wouldn't need to use it today. I had something louder than wood against wood, years of silence finally given structure. The opening arguments were procedural. Her defense tried to cast her as misunderstood, naive, even a young entrepreneur caught in a regulatory net. But every time they said Rachel, I saw my mother flinch, like the word had become radioactive. My father stared blankly at the floor, and Rachel, her eyes darted, but never toward me. I spoke rarely. Only to instruct, only to clarify. Proceed. Clarify the date. Enter Exhibit 14. Each word dry and restrained served the law, not my emotions. But even the brevity spoke volumes. Silence, I had learned, doesn't mean you have nothing to say. It means you're saving your words for when they matter. I saw it in Rachel's shifting posture, the way she squirmed every time I acknowledged a new piece of evidence. Every time I nodded to a witness or passed a ruling on admissibility, it wasn't just a legal act, it was a reminder, I see you. I always saw you. Even when you never looked back. There was a moment when the prosecution replayed one of her viral clips. Rachel, in a crop top, dancing beside neon boxes of her candy captioned, "Eat candy, not veggies." The jury watched silently. But I looked past the screen to my mother's hands gripping the armrest. She had shared that video on Facebook with the caption, "So proud of my baby girl." Now, she couldn't meet my eyes. At recess, I stayed at the bench reviewing notes. My clerk whispered, "Mom, if you'd like to step into chambers." I shook my head. No. Let the room sit with it. I wanted them to feel the gravity, not just of the charges, but of who I had become in the quiet. The girl who was too serious, too cold, too invisible, now commanding the silence that once erased her. One of the junior reporters mouthed to another, "That's the sister." The reply wasn't spoken, just a slow nod. Then a quiet scribble in a notepad. And still I didn't speak beyond duty. It wasn't about being above them. It was about being beyond their narrative. Rachel's lawyer attempted an appeal to sympathy her charity donations, her good intentions. I allowed it. Not because I believed it, but because fairness meant not flinching. Even now, especially now. When court resumed, the bailiff called order, but he barely needed to. The room had trained itself to stay still, like if they rustled too loudly, they might miss a word from the woman they'd once ignored. I saw my aunt in the second row, Aunt Denise, who once told me, "You'll never understand people if you always have your nose in a book." She didn't speak today. She just kept her lips pressed into a line, her eyes never lifting past my chin. I remember thinking they used to lower their voices so I wouldn't hear their judgments. Now they lower their eyes because they can't escape mine. As Rachel took the stand, her voice was small. She said she was sorry she didn't mean to harm anyone, that she trusted the wrong suppliers, that her brand was supposed to make health fun. She tried to make eye contact. I didn't return it, not because I lacked compassion, but because I couldn't afford sentiment here. I had bled too long for this neutrality. The jury looked to me often, unsure if their thoughts matched mine. But I gave them nothing. I wore my robe the way I wore my past, undisplayed but undeniable. When Rachel stepped down, she glanced at her mother, who was pale and clutching a rosary like it was a lifeline. Our father hadn't moved in an hour. His tie was crooked, his eyes dull. I had no idea what they saw when they looked at me now, but I knew what I saw when I looked at them, fragile people who had built their pride on someone else's projection. And now it was shattering. During the final minutes, a young legal intern leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "She doesn't need to say a word. Her silence is the verdict." That moment would be quoted later in an article about judicial presence. But in real time, it was just one more confirmation my absence from their stories had become the force rewriting them. I issued my final words with cool precision. "This concludes today's session. Jury will reconvene tomorrow. Court is adjourned. No gavel slam, no raised voice, just structure upheld." I stood, gathered my papers, and stepped away. Behind me, a courtroom held its breath, not out of fear, but because they understood. This was what justice looked like when it had lived through erasure. This was how authority moves when it no longer asks permission to exist. My mind traced back through years of invisible effort, each step, deliberate, disciplined, and quiet. After law school, I applied for internships at top firms. Powerful names, prestigious placements. Each application ended the same way. "We appreciate your resume, but without a referral, we can't move forward." Doors closed without a trace. I learned early that connections mattered more than competence. Why didn't I have them? Because I read books instead of building networks. Because I was too serious to schmooze. Because I believed merit would speak when they didn't listen. So I found another way. I became a courtroom aide, copying files, filing briefs, lugging boxes of case law volumes up faceless elevators. I showed up early, left late polished glasses for visiting judges, memorized directives they threw offhandedly. At night, I studied their notes. I traced their logic. I made their standards my own. Then came the public defender's office. I walked in resume in hand, knowing full well I was competing against people with legacy lawyers at their backs. But I had stacks of citations, research references, and real courtroom memorandums they'd never ask about. I didn't just claim I cared, I proved that I did one brief after another until they made me an associate. Late nights followed me. I remember nights at 2 a.m., the glow of a single desk lamp outlining stacks of case files. I cross-referenced witness statements, sifted through policy histories, drafted motions until my eyes blurred over the line between law review and life reality. No one celebrated when I sent in my work product. No one noticed I hadn't slept. I think they just assumed lawyers lived like that. Then came the prosecutor's office. I'd been recommended by a senior public defender who appreciated my careful casework and unwavering ethics. Someone who recognized substance did exist behind my quiet demeanor. I joined a team handling serious cases: fraud, assault, financial crimes. I built cases from scratch, interviewing scared victims in cold lobbies, studying complex forensic files, confronting defendants with my calm voice while cameras flashed. Each trial reinforced what I already knew justice demanded: patience, resilience, and unwavering focus. My ability to remain measured became my signature. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult hearing, I found an envelope in my chair's slot labelled, "Simply Congratulations." Inside was an invitation to apply for a judgeship. I was stunned. Nobody in my family had mentioned support or encouragement for this path. I'd spent decades forging ahead alone, but someone else had been paying attention, someone who believed my silent labour mattered. When I arrived for the ceremony, the chamber was elegantly simple, filled with dignitaries, colleagues, and honoured guests. My former clerk, a man who had once doubted my seriousness, shook my hand with tears in his eyes. "You deserved this years ago." As they called my name, I pictured my old bookshelf, those midnight study sessions, the empty graduation seat. It all felt within me in that moment. The applause that followed was genuine. It wrapped around me like kindness I hadn't given myself yet. But afterward, as the crowd dispersed, there was only one person waiting: my former supervising judge. He patted my back and handed me a small notebook. "Keep this," he said. Inside, handwritten notes he'd collected over years: calm reasoning, patient cross-examination, quiet strength. "These are your fingerprints on the law. No family, no father, no mother." Just that note told me I had built something undeniable. Walking home that night, I passed by a familiar bakery where Rachel and our mother once celebrated a viral video milestone. The window displayed cupcakes and balloons. I paused, took a breath, and thought, this time I built something they couldn't erase. This time I wrote my own invitation. Now I sit in courtrooms like the one where Rachel pleaded, holding the gavel, and the authority their disregard built. Each case reminds me of the silent hours, the overlooked victories, the work no one else valued. And yet, here I stand, not because of birthright or branding or applause, but because I earned it, quietly, consistently, without asking for a stage. They taught me that seriousness was a flaw, but I made it my tool. They told me connections mattered more. I built competence. They implied I didn't belong. I arrived, and here knowledge meets power, grounded in purpose. This story, my story, is not about noise. It's about notice. Not about permission, but presence. And as I leave the bench that day with notes, complete docket closed, I know the next chapter is already in motion. But nothing in my personal world has shifted yet. I don't go home. Instead, I sit in chambers, the hush lingering like a presence. My phone buzzes. It's my mother. I stare at the name. My finger hovers. I answer on the 5th ring. "Naomi." Her voice trembles. "Rachel is still your sister. You have to help her." It stings, not because of the plea, but because of the familiarity, that old expectation that I'll always be the one to bear the emotional labour. "I'm not her sister in this courtroom," I say, voice steady. "I'm the presiding judge." Blood roars through my ears. I hear years of being expected to quietly sweep away the crumbs of family shame. Today is not one of those days. This isn't a family matter, I continue. It's a legal proceeding. I cannot intervene. To do so would be acting outside of my duties and undermining the system I've sworn to uphold. Her voice cracks. But she's scared. She needs you. My mother's desperation travels through the line like an echo of every holiday dinner where my concerns were dismissed as drama. I'm sorry, I say finally. I cannot. Good night. I hang up and let the silence unfold around me. Across the desk, I retrieve the small letter Rachel slipped under my chamber's door. I flip it open. The handwriting trembles. Naomi, I finally get it. Your silence. It wasn't spite. It was strength, because I wasn't worth it. I'm sorry. A quiet ache begins in my chest. I drag a fingertip across the page. She didn't ask forgiveness. She explained, and in that, she gave me more than words ever would have. I text my clerk to let her know I'll be late leaving tonight. Once I'm alone again, the chambers feel like a confessional. My robe is still pressed and pinned, but stripped of performance. And maybe that's the point. In solitude, I reach for a photo tucked next to my law degree, Rachel and me, at age 5. She's in a yellow sundress, frosting on her cheeks. I'm beside her, clutching a paperback about Amelia Earhart. She beams into the camera. I look away. I cradle that photo. I see us both, her lightness, my depth. And I understand that one without the other was never truly a story of justice. Minutes later, I calm myself with a pen and notebook. I write, I once stood behind the shadow of my own sister, asked to become invisible so the room would have space for her light. Now, I choose to stand in my own. As I close the notebook, my phone buzzes again. This time, it's from Aunt Lily and Naomi. Aunt Denise spoke with Mum. She's shaken. She said, "She's proud of you." That one line feels like a hand reaching out from the darkness. I reply, "Tell her I'm okay, that I'm doing what I trained to do. Not for them, but because someone had to." Later, I let myself breathe. For a moment, I allow the possibility that maybe this is the first time I'm witnessed for myself, not for living up to someone else's idea of me. Morning comes. Dressed in my suit, rather than judicial robe, I return to chambers. My father stops by with an envelope. Inside a scarf Rachel knitted for me as a child. He says nothing, doesn't have to. I drape the scarf over my desk lamp. It's frayed, rough-edged, but real. I look at their effort too little too late. And it isn't enough, and yet it's something. A start. Maybe? That afternoon, I close the file on Rachel's case and walk through the empty courtroom one last time. I pause halfway down the aisle and imagine my younger self clutching those books, watching me now. Her expression wouldn't be surprise. It would be quiet pride, because the girl who never belonged, who answered Father's "be more like Rachel" with studies and scholarship and unyielding, would see what I've grown into, a woman who carries her own light even when it's eclipsed. This isn't reconciliation, it's reflection. I don't raise the gavel, I don't deliver a speech. I simply step out of that room, carrying what they never gave me. Months later, I returned home for the first time since the trial. Not because I wanted to, but because even silence needs a context. I walked into the old house, each floorboard groaning like it remembered my absence, and in every familiar creak I sensed a quiet question: who owns this place now? My old bedroom door had been repainted. New curtain rods, fresh coat of pale pink. The house felt smaller, fresher, like someone had taken a long, deliberate breath and started over. Inside, the desk where I once studied, littered with glossy TikTok posters. Rachel's face smiled down from a Veggie Sweet launch billboard, taped above the desk. Perfect hair, perfect lighting, perfect teeth. My chair scooped of its cushion, its wheels gone. I stood still. It wasn't poetic vandalism, it was practical erasure. I had expected emptiness. I'd hoped for that. But I felt shame flicker instead. Shame for having once allowed their version of me to define my worth. The room wasn't hers anymore. She hadn't earned it, but the symbolism still hurt. I ran a finger along the desktop scars, the gouges from late-night outlines, the spilled coffee rings from finals week that were as much mine as they were invisible to everyone else. I remembered how I left for Georgetown with only 2 bags and a heart full of determination. The day I moved out, I assumed this room would wait. I thought it would preserve the person I was, sharp-minded, strangely solitary, not yet silent. Instead, it became a stage prop for someone else's narrative. I thought about reclaiming it, tearing down the posters, reinstalling my bookshelves. But I didn't. Instead, I turned and walked out, closing the door with quiet purpose. The space remained hers as it should have, but inside me it was mine again. The real change came years later when I stepped into the halls of justice, the same halls I'd once dreamt of, while studying in that pink-walled room. Portraits lined polished wood-panelled walls, chief justices in powdered wigs, trailblazing jurists breaking barriers, defenders of upstate's moral compass. In the centre hung my likeness, graceful but unapologetic. It wasn't framed with glamour shots or editorial airs. It was lit by institutional approval, not social media light. I remember the first time I stood beneath it. My gaze drifted up and I felt the weight of every late-night briefing, every discouraging knockback, every whispered dismissal for being too intense. And I understood that this place, it wasn't just authority. It was vindication. The blueprint of a girl robbed of applause, but ultimately entrusted with influence. Outside chambers, staffers nodded, greeting me. Inside the courtroom, attorneys crossed themselves politely, and I realised it was more than title. It was embodiment of consistency and belief in structures bigger than any one person. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had taken a sledgehammer to my old room. I suspect nothing would have changed. The walls would have been painted over, shelves removed, but the person I intended to erase, Naomi, would have stayed. Because identity isn't tied to wallpaper. It's quietly written in actions and in silence upheld, not in symbols imposed. Standing behind the bench, I don't speak about that room or that erasure. But I see it in every case file that passes before me. Someone who never believed their story, someone edited out of histories, someone asked to be less. Maybe I used to be them, and now I ensure the court never asks it again. There's a quiet irony in knowing that a room designed to erase me became the birthplace of my ambition. It didn't own me, it fueled me. My authority isn't inherited, it's earned in absence. And every portrait, every gavel, every emblem of dignity is proof of that. Sometimes, late at night when the halls are silent and the security lights hum, I walk back past that portrait. I don't touch it. I just stand and say under my breath, "Thank you." Not to my face, not in public headline, but to the determination that survived erasure. Because this room was decorated by someone else's values. But it housed my values. And that's where real power grows, not in the space, but in the soul. A week after that courtroom session, I found a small, unmarked envelope slipped beneath the door of my office. No stamp, no return address, just my name, scrawled in the kind of careful handwriting that comes from someone unsure they should be writing at all. Inside was a photograph. It was old, grainy, likely from a school newsletter. I was 11, standing stiff in front of a trifold science fair board titled "The Efficiency of Solar Panels in Low Light." My hair was in tight braids. My glasses were too big. My smile was unsure, as if I didn't know yet whether I was allowed to be proud. Behind me stood a row of people, teachers, parents, other students. No one was clapping, no one even looking in my direction. One woman in the back was mid-yawn. Another scrolled through her phone. Even then, at that early moment of supposed triumph, I had known what it felt like to stand in a bright spotlight while still being invisible. There was no note with the photo. but I didn't need one. I knew Rachel had sent it. I looked at it for a long time. My hand trembled slightly, not with anger, but with something quieter. A tenderness I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. That child, too serious, too curious, too loud with the wrong kinds of questions, was still inside me. And maybe after everything Rachel finally saw her too. I walked across my office and opened the bottom drawer of my cabinet. From it, I pulled a framed photograph the day of my appointment to the bench. I'm standing between two senators and the President of the United States, who had signed my confirmation in blue ink, still visible in the corner. My robe is folded neatly over my arm. I'm smiling, but not performing. Not trying. Just existing in a space I had carved with quiet, ferocious dignity. I placed the science fair photo beside it. Not behind, not under, beside. They belonged together, not because the past defines the present, but because it informs it. That young girl with the awkward stance and the half-hopeful eyes was the blueprint. She built this, and she deserved to see where her foundation led. Later that day, I held a high-stakes hearing involving 2 corporate defendants and a whistleblower. Tensions were high. A defense attorney interrupted sharply, trying to discredit testimony with a legal technicality. The courtroom buzzed, eyes flicked to me, waiting, expecting a raised voice, a bang of the gavel. Instead, I paused. I breathed. I pictured that 11-year-old version of myself, her shaky hands, her brilliant mind, her quiet bravery. And I said calmly, "Objection overruled. The testimony stands." The stillness returned. The gavel wasn't needed. That girl had taught me how to steady storms. Later, my clerk approached me with a hesitant smile. "That was precise," she said. "You didn't even blink." I glanced at the photo now tucked in my planner. "I've been practicing since the 5th grade, I replied. She didn't understand. But I did, and that was enough. That night, I received another email from Rachel. The subject line was simply, "Another one." It was another photo, this time of us together, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She's holding a birthday balloon beaming. I'm next to her, hands behind my back, watching the balloon, not the camera. We were never enemies, just orbiting different planets trying to be seen in the same solar system. Her message read, "I'm sorry I took your room. I didn't realize I also took your space. You built something I never could. And now I see that silence was the loudest thing you ever gave me." I didn't respond right away. Some letters aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to land. And this one did. I closed my laptop and turned back toward the wall of my office. Beneath the soft glow of a reading lamp, those 2 photos now lived side by side. One taken in isolation, one surrounded by accolades. But both held the same truth: I had always been enough, even when no one clapped, especially then. The next morning, I added a small note under the science fair photo, just 3 words in cursive ink. She survived anyway, because she did, and tomorrow she would judge again, with clarity, with purpose, and with the unshakable certainty that no one could ever again write her out of the story. Months after placing those photos in my office, a shift came, not sudden, but seismic in its quiet unfolding. I stopped answering family calls. Not out of anger more, because answering implied obligation, and obligation without respect wasn't something I would offer again. No dramatics, no full-stop messages, just silence. That silence held space for me. It held space for the courtroom and for every order I issued. It held space for the advocates who trusted me to see them. It held space for the young girl in the photo who needed to know she belonged somewhere beyond applause. It also held space for an invitation. One afternoon, a note arrived from a Washington-based civic forum. Would I speak at a leadership symposium on judicial ethics and public trust? The theme, the architecture of silent power. The title alone resonated. When I took the podium at the symposium, the room held senators, judges, non-profit leaders, even former clerks I'd mentored. I stood in sharp tailoring the photos hidden out of sight, but their influence echoed in every syllable I spoke. Silence is not surrender, I began. It's design. It isn't an admission of defeat. It's an intentional structure on which integrity stands. I spoke of courtroom presence and unspoken authority, of how being silent didn't mean being voiceless, it meant choosing when to speak and caring more about the weight of words than their volume. I shared the story of the science fair photo and the investiture portrait, not to recreate my journey, but to highlight that power isn't always applause, it's architecture. And good architecture can last centuries. Afterward, people approached me, journalists, attendees, a few young law clerks saying the line struck deeper than any speech they'd heard. A senator mentioned quoting me on the Senate floor. A young attorney from California said the talk answered questions she'd carried her whole career. When do I choose silence? When do I stand up? Silence became a tool I no longer needed to explain. Shortly after, Time magazine published its next cover. The black, bold letters read, "The Rising Judiciary," and front and centre was me. The photo taken years earlier by a court photographer of me returning from that hearing with Rachel. Robed, poised, calm. The kind of image that didn't shout. It just was. Underneath a line read Chief Justice Naomi Ellis. They erased me from the family, so I carved myself into the law. Seeing my face on that cover felt strange, elating, disorienting, and still somehow distant. I had carried that moment like private gold. And now the world held it too. But I didn't chase the attention. Instead, I set it down, letting it rest in archives, and displayed risk. Because the building I'd constructed wasn't veneer. It was foundation. Every case, every hearing, every quiet decision had built something that no headline could erase. In the weeks that followed, I found myself downplaying invitations to talk shows. I declined weekend family events. I accepted only work that aligned with my purpose, a pro bono clinic, a mentor program for underrepresented law students, advisory groups on judicial conduct. It wasn't about distance, it was about discernment. One day, I received a letter from Rachel, a printed, typed letter this time. She wrote of her progress therapy, public apologies, rebuilding her brand responsibly. She admitted it wasn't easy. She asked whether I would ever see her again, not in court, not in public, but personally as family. I held the letter for days. I thought of complaining relatives who assumed forgiveness was a debt I owed. I thought of my younger self, the girl craving acknowledgement, not performance. I thought of the house, the room, the portraits I thought of silent architecture. And my heart told me I am not there yet, but I'm allowed to consider it. After all, forgiveness isn't a directive. It's a choice, and it's not something I owe. So I folded the letter and placed it on my desk next to a client file priority future, not past. That evening, I stood by my office window, looking out at the city lights. Power paused there, not loud, but steady. It's calm like the inside of a library where ideas outlast noise, where values quietly cultivated become structures that hold up generations. My family eventually called less fearing rejection. Eventually they stopped. My mother's number blinked on my phone once in a blue moon, a silent question. I let it stay unanswered. Not from malice, but from realization. Love can be fierce, but it can't overshadow the person who earned her own seat. Because I didn't build this to get love from them. I built it to prove to the girl in the science fair photo, and to every person who's ever been told they weren't enough, that silence, purpose, and perseverance can carve halls of justice more lasting than applause. In my chambers, by my desk lamp, stands that photo and the investiture portrait. Their memory and milestone, not tokens, testimony. They tell me who I was, who I became, and who I will continue to be. I walk into court tomorrow as always, not to make a scene, but to anchor order. Not to gain notice, but to deserve it. Because structure holds far longer than sentiment. And as the world turns its attention toward justice, I'll stand there not as someone asking for permission, but as someone who carved permission into her own stones. So, if you've ever sat quietly at a dinner table feeling invisible, if you've ever been told you're too much, too serious, too different, just know this. Maybe you weren't made to fit their frame. Maybe you were born to build your own. Because power doesn't always come wrapped in praise. Sometimes it comes in silence, in effort, in choosing not to disappear even when no one claps. And to the ones still sitting alone with your dreams, keep building. Not for validation, but for the quiet joy of knowing you mattered even if no one said it out loud. You were never too much. You were always enough. And sometimes enough just needs time to echo back. If this story found you, if something in it felt like your own, consider staying. Hit subscribe, not just for more stories, but for reminders that you're not alone in building something real. Your silence has meaning, your strength has shape, and your voice, even if it whispers, is welcome here.